Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we're talking about how to read the Bible. Oh my goodness, I haven't even set up the PowerPoint for this. This is terrible. Talking about how to read the Bible, and we're starting class number 3. I am slightly behind with what I'm teaching here at the church. I didn't quite finish translation last time, but we covered it in the video here, so I'm not going to go back and do some of that. Instead, what we're going to talk about this time is... look at how smooth that is. Narratives. The Old Testament and their narratives. And I should probably pull out notes on this because this is the first time my notes go from being 1 line or 3 lines to actually being substantive and ready to follow, like I should actually follow them. Old Testament narratives are fascinating. Very, very interesting. The way that we're going to be doing this, by the way, breaking down each and every genre of the Bible, is vaguely in chronological order. So we'll start here with the Old Testament narratives. When you open the Old Testament, you start in Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 is a story. Genesis chapter 2 is a story. And you go like that through halfway through Exodus, in which case you switch over to some laws. So next class period, guess what it's going to be? Narratives, and then laws, and then probably prophets, and then wisdom literature. That may be a little bit out of order. Maybe I don't remember. I haven't planned it out that far. It's just kind of the general theory. Old Testament narratives is where we start because that's where the Old Testament starts. And Old Testament narratives are really, really important because these are the stories that you're going to be the most familiar with, right? This is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is Joshua conquering the land. This is everything to do with Moses. This is the judges. This is David. This is all of the kings. The prophets find their footing in the narratives. Yes, most of their books are dedicated to prophecy, but they stem from this area of stories, right? They have a place in their story. They exist there for a reason or for a purpose. And so it's just, it's a good place to start, is to understand the narratives, to understand the background information, and then you can start going from there. Once you understand narrative, you can understand a lot of other things. I do find that when people look at narratives, what they instantly envision is something like a history book, and so, you read a history book and what it says is what it says, and it's pretty simple, or maybe you read a story and what it says is what it says. It's pretty simple, right? You read Lord of the Rings, and it's Frodo and Sam going on a journey, and they go on their journey, and it's pretty simple, or whatever it is. But actually, narratives are really complicated. The more and more you look into narratives, the more and more you start to realize how complex interpreting them can actually be. And for people who are familiar with the Old Testament, or people who are familiar with the Bible in general, that statement is like, no, they're not complicated. You read them and you have all these pre-built assumptions of how you interpret them and how you understand them, which is good. I'm glad that people are able to interpret and understand them accurately. But for someone who's coming into this for the first time, or for someone who wants to be able to explain why you interpret things the way you interpret things, it actually gets fairly complicated. So here's my best attempt to dive into a lot of why this is complicated. Along with this, I will mention again that this is based on a book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, by what are their names? Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. That's the book. Again, I don't agree with everything that's in this book. I don't support everything that they mention. Some of it's just not true at all. But a lot of the details and a lot of the specific points that I'm mentioning and the order in which I'm mentioning them is because they're brought up in the book. And I said, yeah, that's actually a really good idea. So credit to them for inspiring all of this class. And, you can always go read the book, even if you don't agree with everything I say in class or everything that they wrote down. Hopefully it's a good resource for you to at least think, and then you can come up with some things for yourself. The Old Testament narratives. I'm not on the screen anymore. There we go. Firstly, we have to talk about why are we talking about genres. In class, this will serve as a reset point for me because, we're going from interpretation and why you should interpret to translations and what translation you should be reading, and then we're just kind of jumping into narratives, and it's going to be the middle of a class session anyway because I have to finish up narratives from last time this Sunday morning. So wait, why do we have to talk about genres? Well, number one, when you read a book of poems and you read a book of history, you should not be reading them in the same way. When you read Celery Raw develops the jaw, but celery stewed is more quietly chewed, that's not, like, that's a funny saying. That's not history. That's not like, wow, somebody's entire life was wrapped up in that statement. If you read it with the same kind of gravitas as you would read a book on World War II history, you're going to miss the point of the poem, because the point of the poem is not to be that serious or not to be that impactful or not to report the truest of events in the most literal detail imaginable. In World War II, you're going to have, detailed analytics of who went where and how many people died and what they died from and all these different things. If you express that in a poem, the poem loses some of its quality. If you read a poem book as a book of history, you're going to have messed up. Do not read them the same way. The Bible, in the same way, it's not one genre. And when you start talking about the Bible and what genres they are, or what genres it has in it, it's a lot of them. I forget exactly how I've laid it out. So, for instance, you have stories in it, narratives. Some people, by the way, narrative and story, to me, it's like the same thing. The technical nuance in it is, I believe when people say stories, a lot of times we think fictional stories and stuff that's made up. And so some people, for that reason, are uncomfortable saying that the Bible has stories in it, because that would imply in their heads that the Bible is made up. And instead they like saying narratives because it feels more official. I don't care about that. I know the Bible's true, and I'm not that insecure about it, but if it helps you to think about how serious the Bible is, I'll say narratives a lot of times, or I'll try to say narratives, because for some people that's an issue. I don't care. It has narratives, it has stories, it has prophecies in it, it has poetry in it. It also has what's called the bios. When you read a gospel, it's not the same kind of story. It is similar to a book of narratives. It is similar to history, but it's a little bit different. It's not a biography, but it is much closer to that kind of thing. The technical genre in Greek is called a bio. That's what they are. And we'll talk about some of those specifics when we get there. There are just, the epistles, right? You read some of the letters. They're just books of doctrine. When you read life advice in the Bible, you start thinking of Proverbs, probably. Or maybe you talk about parables, because parables are a specific genre of how to tell different stories that are probably not true, but serve to illustrate a point. They are preacher stories, things that you make up to serve a point, rather than things that are specifically true, like a life example. So there's your technical difference, I guess. There's also a book of philosophy, which would be Ecclesiastes, and maybe you could put Job in there. There are books of commands. That's the law that we'll talk about in next week. There are also incomprehensible images. Go read Revelation. Go read Zechariah. Go read the second half of Daniel, right? There are weird things that are not just, they are prophecies, and they are looking forward to the future, but they're not merely prophecies, right? They're not like other prophecies. They're something else. A lot of times we call them apocalypses because they are apocalyptic literature. That's a whole different genre. When you're talking about the Bible, if you don't know what you're reading, you won't know how to understand it. And if you don't know which kind of section you're in, then the odds that you will have good interpretation on that section are going to be relatively minimal. So let's talk about narratives. And the first thing you have to talk about with narratives, with stories that are happening, history, is what kind of narrative are you talking about? Like, what level of narrative? And for reference, the church that I'm working with here has just on Wednesday nights gone through a study of Joseph, and I find Joseph to be a useful illustration for a lot of what we're talking about with narratives, because Joseph's story fits into a bunch of different categories here. And so as we go through, I will use Joseph as a primary example, and hopefully you're able to learn some stuff. I'm not going to delve into a lot of specifics about Joseph, but there are some implications about maybe his story, and then even broader from there, just the narratives in general, true stories. What level of narrative are we talking about? Well, you got the first level of narrative, the base level, which is the individual story. When you read Genesis 37, verses 12 through 36, I put my Bible away. I'm not going to read that, but that's the story where, that's the narrative. Okay, I'm going to quit that. That's the story where Joseph is sent out to seek his brothers and find his brothers. He finds them, but as he's coming to them, as they are far away, they hate him. They look at him and say, let's get rid of him. And so they do. They throw him in a pit and ultimately sell him off into slavery. That's Genesis 37, verses 12 through 36. If I am going to preach a lesson, or if I'm going to, have a class period, I can have it on an individual story. And that can be the level at which I engage with the narrative. I can delve into all of the details. I can, minutely kind of process every little thing that's happening. And that can be really important to delve into individual stories on that kind of minute and technical level. But you also have a level of narrative that is broader than that would say this is the individual's story. I don't have a better way to phrase that. I'm sure there is one. I'm sure I could think about it. But at this point, it's been in my PowerPoint long enough. It's kind of canonized itself in my head. And so that's how I think about it. C'est la vie, I guess. You have an individual story. You have Genesis 37, in which you talk about how Judah is such a terrible person because he's the one who comes up with the idea of selling Joseph. You have Reuben, who is not quite as bad as the others because he doesn't resist them throwing Joseph in a pit. He doesn't say, no, this is wrong, don't do it, but he does intend to rescue the boy, and so he is technically better. You can debate all those things at the level of the individual story. But when you get to the individual's story, you're talking about the story of Joseph in general. And suddenly, you're not talking about what role Judah played in this one instance in the Joseph story. You are talking about Joseph's story and how these things play out. He goes from being a son, his father elevates him, he's the best of the sons, and so they throw him in a pit. He becomes a slave, and then he becomes the best of the slaves in Potiphar's house, but then he's falsely accused, and so he becomes a prisoner, but then he becomes the best of the prisoners, but then he's ignored by the cupbearer, or the butler, who, benefits from Joseph's help and then promptly forgets about everything Joseph, and Joseph has to sit for another 2 years before anything happens to him. Suddenly, I have completely... I'm no longer thinking about Judah's portion of the story. I'm no longer thinking about Reuben's portion of the story. I'm thinking about how does Genesis 37 verses 12 through 36 play into Joseph's story in general, and I'm able to see the ups and downs of Joseph's life, and I'm able to make an application from that. Then you have to zoom out one more time, because if we're going to talk about Joseph's story, we have to talk about the role he plays in the history of God's people. Joseph is not in a vacuum here. You go and read the book of Genesis. We start out after Genesis 11, there's a time jump. Genesis 12 starts with Abraham, then Abraham goes to Isaac, then Isaac goes to Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. Joseph is the second youngest of those sons. He's the 11th, I believe he's the 11th out of them. He is the father's favorite son, and the story follows Joseph. Why does the story follow Joseph? Because Joseph is the catalyst which gets Israel into the land of Egypt. When you open Exodus chapter 1, theoretically, you could open Exodus chapter 1 after Genesis 36. Genesis 36 says Jacob has 12 sons. They're Israel. They're the people of Israel and the tribes of Israel, etc. And then you open Exodus chapter 1, and it's the people of Israel in Egypt. Okay, how did we get there? Joseph's story plays a massive role in how they got there. Maybe the reason that Joseph capitalizes, or Joseph is focused on in this latter section of Genesis, is because he's the piece that gets them from point A to point B. And when I start thinking about Joseph's story as that, I start to realize a few different things, such as when you think about Genesis 37, it is a terrible travesty and just a horror that Joseph's siblings, his brothers, would sell him into slavery. When I think about the individual's story in Genesis 37 through 50, which is basically about Joseph, basically entirely about Joseph. Not entirely, but most all of it is. When I think about that, suddenly I realize the selling into slavery, it is bad, but it's just kind of a microcosm of a lot of things that keep happening in his life because he keeps being put down a level. He's put down by his brothers. He's then put down by his master's wife. He's then put down by a guy in the prison with him, right? He keeps being put down. And suddenly I realized it's broader than that. It's not just a horrible thing to happen. That's just kind of how Joseph's life was for a lot of it. But then as you put it in the history of God's people, in the broader context of the book of Genesis, you start to realize how much of a blessing it is that Genesis 37 happened, that Joseph was sold into slavery. What happens if Joseph isn't sold into slavery in Egypt? What happens if he doesn't attain dominance in Egypt? What happens when the 7-year-long famine comes around and nobody's prepared for it? Because remember, Joseph is the reason people got prepared for it. Joseph says in, I think it's Genesis 50, it's one of the later chapters of Genesis, "You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, and God has used me to save a bunch of people, to save people and make sure that they live." What happens if Genesis 37, 12 through 36 doesn't go through? Well, everybody dies. And suddenly the thing that looked like a curse, when you zoom in on it at an individual level, suddenly as you zoom out, starts to look like, actually, that's a pretty cool blessing that was given. I would not say I'm a believer in the everything happens for a reason kind of crowd. Time and chance happen to all men. I just believe that. Like, stuff happens, right? Life happens to you. That's how it goes. But I am a believer that God can cause all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so one of the things that you see is a lot of times you see people complaining about how difficult their lives are, and a lot of times their lives are very difficult. But when you zoom out a little bit, you look at Genesis 37, man, that's awful. You look at Genesis 37 through 50, okay, like, it's terrible, but it's kind of comparable to a lot of other stuff that happened. You look at the book of Genesis and suddenly you start to realize, hey, that was actually a really good thing that happened. It's not good that it happened. It's not good that Joseph was imprisoned. It's not good or righteous that his brothers did that to him. But if they hadn't, how many people would have died? And so even though it is, in the moment, it is a terrible tragedy, when you zoom out, you start to see, actually, that worked out okay. Actually, God did mean that for good, and he turned that around to make it happen and turned it into something good. And suddenly the tragedy of the moment becomes something that is a blessing in the long term. A lot of times people are zoomed in on one point in their life on how they're suffering or they have incurred some loss, and they ask God, why would you allow this to happen? Sometimes the answer is, when you get the big picture, you recognize, hey, actually that was a blessing. Not always, right? Sometimes it's more difficult to see, and it may be true that sometimes there is no blessing in it. I have no idea, right? You can argue with me all day about that if you want to. But the point is, a lot of times when you zoom out, things aren't actually as bad as you thought they were, or they ended up a lot better than you thought they would. Interesting to consider. An individual story, an individual's story, the history of God's people, and of course then we have to talk about God's plan of redemption, which is in the entire Bible, but in this case it's the Old Testament, right? Moving into the New Testament. When you start to see Joseph's point of view as you go through, Joseph's story is, it's terrible that he was sold into slavery. But if he never got sold into slavery, Israel would never have gone into Egypt. If Israel had never gone into Egypt, they would never have been called out of Egypt in the Exodus. And the Exodus is really important because the Exodus is God's people escaping the slavery of Egypt to then be delivered and go to a new land where they can follow a new law, where they can be obedient to God and be it's just a new people, a resurrected people coming out the other side. They experienced something terrible, but God freed them from their torment and suffering so that they could be people of his and so that they could work with him. And suddenly, when you get to the New Testament, those ideas are all really important because suddenly the Exodus isn't really about the physical deliverance of God's people anymore. Suddenly, the Exodus becomes about a picture of God freeing people from sin. what God does is, what we see in the New Testament is everyone is sold under sin. We are all slaves to sin. God comes in and rescues us from sin, and he brings us out to a new country, a heavenly country, the spiritual country, which is the location where we now live. And so even though we exist here on the earth still, our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we're going. That's where we're headed towards. That's the good place that we're all going to end up being in. And if Exodus doesn't happen, then salvation from sins gets a lot more complicated and convoluted. If the Exodus doesn't happen, with the slavery being removed and the people being freed and brought to a new land, then what happens in the New Testament? Then do we get free from our sin? Do we get delivered to a new land? How does God picture that so that we can have a good understanding of exactly how the transaction went down? And for Exodus to happen, Joseph had to happen. And so suddenly, the individual story of Genesis 37 is not a tragedy at all. The individual story of Genesis 37 is a man being sold into slavery, partly because he made some bad decisions. He potentially made some bad decisions when he talked about his dreams in front of his brothers. It is one man reaping the consequences of something that he said, even though he may not have said them maliciously, he may not have said them to inspire hatred, but he did inspire hatred. He did something foolish, he got consequences for it, and now he's a slave in Egypt. But through God's deliverance, God pulls all of them out of Egypt and frees everyone from the consequences of their sin. That suddenly has massive implications for the New Testament, and Genesis 37 verses 12 through 36 has gone through being one of just the most terrible tragedies you could imagine to being actually something that was really important, and in a strange way, I'm kind of glad that it happened. Because if it didn't happen, what are the consequences for me today? When you look at the levels of narrative, you start to realize this is actually kind of complicated, isn't it? If I'm reading a story, if I'm listening, if I'm going to preach a sermon, I could preach it on any of these levels. Genesis 37, that one particular story, I can mine it for data. Genesis 37 through 50, I can summarize Joseph. I have before in a sermon. Genesis in general, I can summarize the book and show you where the history of God's people is. Or I can summarize the Old Testament and the New Testament and try to get you the broadest picture possible to show what God is doing throughout all of time. When I'm studying personally, when I'm studying to put some material together to teach it, I have to answer that kind of question. When you're studying personally, when you're reading narratives, you have to ask that kind of question, because sometimes we only make application from the individual story, and we don't think about how, Exodus 2 affects Moses on the whole, or Exodus 20 affects Moses on the whole. Like, we read Exodus 20, one of the things I mentioned in Monday's sermon, the sermon that's coming out on Monday, that did come out on Monday from the perspective of this video coming out on Wednesday. One of the things that I mentioned there was Exodus chapter 20, where God speaks to the people directly and Israel is terrified of him. A lot of times we delve into that and we think about how God spoke to the people directly and so it terrified them, right? That is the individual story. But when we think about the broader picture, the individual's story, it means that God can no longer speak from heaven and the people of Israel listen to him. That fundamentally changes Moses' job. Moses was, in many ways, he was a physical leader who is helping to determine disputes and stuff in Israel, but his main purpose was to shepherd them physically and make sure they go from one location to the other and eventually get to the land of Canaan. By the time you get to Exodus 20, God says, that's true. I cannot speak directly to the people. He starts speaking directly through Moses. And that's Moses' job for the rest of his life, is no longer merely a physical leader. He is the spiritual leader because he receives revelation from God and then gives it to the people. If Exodus 20, verse 18 and 19 didn't exist, with the people being freaked out at God's voice, then we would call the law, but instead we call it the law of Moses, because of the impact that those two verses had on the character and the story of Moses on the whole. Sometimes we are so zoomed into individual stories, we forget what they mean for the characters on the whole, and sometimes we are so zoomed out to characters on the whole or how this informs the rest of the New Testament or the Old Testament, the Bible in general, that we forget to zoom into the specific narratives and dissect the little pieces that are coming out. Be careful with that. Pay attention to that. When you are reading a narrative, you have to consciously make a decision on what level you're going to read at, because every level you read at is going to mean something slightly different to you. The core aspects of the story won't change, but what they mean to you are going to shift around. What level of narrative are you talking about? Individual story, individual's story, history of God's people, or God's plan of redemption? You have to think about that. What level of narrative are you actually covering? We are one slide in on this, by the way. I hope this is not too terribly long. This is probably not all going to fit in one session at church. This is probably going to be a couple of lessons, but we'll work through it. A second thing we have to ask is what kind of history? And this is where a lot of the bulk of the narrative section comes out, because we have to think about what kind of history is being told and communicated to us. And so here are a bunch of suggestions about what God is communicating and how it's happening. Number one, this is theological history. That is to say, God is the main character. When you look at the story of Adam, why am I being told the story of Adam? It's not really because Adam was a great guy. It's because God was doing something through Adam. When I'm told the story of Noah, why am I told the story of Noah? Noah was a great guy in general, but it's not because Noah was a great guy, right? There are countless great people throughout history, very impressive people, very moral people, very righteous people that do not get stories about them. But I'm told the story of Noah for a reason. Why is that? It's because God is doing something through Noah. And if you forget that God's the main character, you're going to lose a lot of the plot. The Bible is fundamentally, it's kind of like God's autobiography. God is trying to tell the story of what he's doing and how he's helping and how he's involved and everything like that. God is trying to tell people that in the Bible, in his history. And so don't be surprised when this is theological history. This is God as the main character. Joseph is not the main character of Joseph's story. And if you think he is the main character of Joseph's story, you're going to be sadly mistaken. God is the main character. Don't forget that. What kind of history? We're dealing with theological history. We're also dealing with literal history. These are not allegories, much as many people will try and convince you otherwise. Allegories are basically hidden meanings. Allegory is when someone tells a story, but they're not really telling just their story. They're really trying to communicate something else very, very clearly. It's not telling a story which has certain themes that have certain implications. It is telling a story which is just telling another story. For instance, if you read the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan is Jesus. Like, he is Jesus. You replace Aslan with Jesus, and basically nothing in the story changes. Nothing in the story really hinges on Aslan being a literal lion. It hinges on Aslan working with people and redeeming people and sacrificing himself for people. That's who Aslan is. If you cut out Aslan, you replace every mention of Aslan with Jesus, it's the same story. Basically, it's an allegory, and it's a decent allegory from what I remember, but it is an allegory. That is not what the Bible is, right? Abraham did exist. There was a man named Origen, or Origen is how most people say it, back in the day, who was convinced. Paul, at one point in one of his letters, Galatians, I think it's chapter 4, he says, look, the two wives of Abraham are allegories. One is Hagar, who is a slave under the old system, and one is Sarah, who is a free woman under the new system. She's the one through whom the child of promise is. Basically, don't be so adherent to the old law that you're not going to be a Christian, because Christianity is the completed form that God was looking forward to the whole time. That's his point. And he says so and by saying, hey, this is kind of an allegory. Here it is. But Paul is not saying Abraham didn't exist as a person. And Origen decided to say, well, that means Abraham didn't exist as a person. That's ridiculous. When God is telling these stories, again, they're not stories as in the made-up sense. They are narratives. They are history that happened. This is literal history. When you read this stuff, it's true. This is not just God making things up. If you assume that God is just making things up or that these people didn't actually exist, you're going to miss a lot of the finer details, because these are real people, real places, real times, and all these things did happen. Of course, if you're a skeptic, you're going to say, no, they didn't happen because miracles don't happen or whatever. Whole different conversation. Not something that I'm able to touch here in the narratives. Just saying, this is literal history. This is how it's told. Even if you don't believe, I guess here's the accommodating way to say it, even if you don't believe it's literal history, that it actually happened, the way the Bible tells it is framing it as literal history. And so when you read it and assume that it's not literal history, you miss the point of what the Bible writers are going for. Even if you think they're making everything up, they are telling it as if it is real. So there's the quick and easy way to say that. This is also apparent history. There are no hidden meanings. It's not to say there are not deeper themes. It's not to say you can't analyze these at deeper levels. Again, when you zoom Genesis 37 verses 12 through 35 or whatever it was, when you zoom that out into the lens of the entirety of the Bible and how that helps to prefigure sin and salvation, yes, there are hidden themes in there. There are little pictures that are like, oh, I can see what God's doing in that. But when you dive into the history, when you dive into the narratives, you're not going to find a bunch of little hidden meanings that change your theology and how things work. It's not a revelation that God forgives sins. It's interesting to see that God forgives sins, and it's prefigured in Joseph's story, but it's not like that's a new revelation. It's not like that's surprising. It's not like somebody said, oh, well, God forgives sins? That's crazy. I've never heard that before. If you've read the Bible, no, you know that that's coming. It is apparent. There aren't hidden meanings. So if you're spending all your time diving into Scientology, or if I need to stop dunking on other religious groups, if you spend your time diving into the wild theories or the Gnostic Gospels or the hidden meaning, but if you pay us a bunch of money, we'll tell you what the hidden meaning is, you're going to miss the point. These are apparent. There are no hidden meanings. In general, just what it says is what it says, and it's quite apparent. This is also illustrative history, which means it illustrates what's happening. They show a path that you should be going on, or they just show a path in general, maybe even a path that you shouldn't be going on. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But these do not make commands. For instance, in Joseph's story, Joseph is in Potiphar's house, Potiphar being a powerful Egyptian official. Potiphar's wife comes to Joseph multiple times over, tries to seduce him and do all sorts of things that are immoral and not right. Joseph says, no, I'm not going to do that. How could I do this great evil and sin against God, is how he says it. Where in Joseph's story does it say, thou shalt not commit adultery? Where in Joseph's story does it say that thou shalt not commit adultery with thy master's wife, right? Where in Joseph's story does God come down and say, Joseph, I know that woman's really hot, but you shouldn't do that. This is a law. It doesn't say that, because the point of the history is not to make commands about these things. God has a whole section called law that we'll talk about next. That's going to be important. That's where God makes his commands. When you read through the narrative, you don't really get commands. When Nathan comes to David about Bathsheba, he doesn't say, thou shalt not commit adultery. He says, you know you messed up, right? And David says, yeah, because they both know law from somewhere else. And that is a story that illustrates the picture. It shows you that adultery is bad. It shows you that righteous people reject adultery. It shows you that the temptation is not worth it, and that righteous people center God in their lives instead of following after these other people. It is illustrative. It shows you how to live, even though it doesn't say, thou shalt this or thou shalt not that. When you're looking for history, it's not about commands, okay? Narratives are not about commands. Laws are, and that's a very different thing. A fifth thing is you should see that the story is simple. Not every part of the story is supposed to have its own moral. Not every part does, and not every part is supposed to. For instance, Joseph is approached by Potiphar's wife. She attempts to seduce him. It doesn't work. The moral of the story is don't do that, right? It is, well, for women, don't seduce men. For men, don't give in to the seduction, right? That's the general moral of the story of Potiphar's wife. Now, if you remember, if you can delve into all of the specifics and every part of the story, and you could say, well, Joseph also ran away from Potiphar's wife. She grabbed him by the shirt or by the garment one time, and he ran away and escaped without his garment, and then she used his garment as proof that he had tried to assault her. The moral of the story is, if you're going to be in a compromised situation, then don't leave your clothes behind. That can be true, but that's not the point of the story. And when you try and make every little part of the story have its own moral or be its own teaching, a lot of times details are very useful, and if you're familiar with what I do, a lot of times it is just diving into the details and trying to figure out things from the details that were given. They are very useful, but if you are so insistent that every part of the story has to have its own kind of moral and its own kind of teaching, and it has to be unique in its own kind of way, you're going to overemphasize some things, and you're going to underemphasize some other things. You're going to miss the simple point of the story by trying to delve too deep into all of the little sections. So, just be aware that this is simple history. I'm going to take a break here, actually. I'm going to take a drink of water, because we are only halfway through this list. I believe there are 10 items on this list. What kind of history is it? Yes, that's the kind of history it is. It's complicated. How are you? Okay, not actually. I didn't actually ask that. Unapproved history. This is a funny thing to say. This is unapproved history because the things that are reported are not inherently good. I wish that people would understand this, and sometimes people don't, especially with how we translate stories and traditional interpretations of stories. A lot of times I am not the most traditional of guys. I do respect tradition in an awful lot of situations where a lot of people don't, but I also ignore traditions in a lot of instances where people do pay attention to their traditions. For instance, I have no idea if I'm going to bring this up on Sunday or not, or how far I'm going to push that. The Book of Esther, I don't like it. I think Esther is, frankly, it is a book about bad people through whom God still works anyway. Most people, most Christians that I know of, when they've heard that statement, and when I've had the conversation with others, most Christians that I know of would think that is ridiculous and almost heretical, because Esther is a book about good people who are in trying circumstances, and God helps them overcome their trying circumstances because they are trying to be good. I just don't think that's true. When I read Esther, that's not what I see, right? People will, for instance, here's the specific example. People will say, Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman. Why not? Because Mordecai is a good person, and good people don't bow to other human beings. Good people bow only to God. What we see in Esther is Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman, and that's all that we see. We don't see why he does it. We don't see what caused him to do it. We don't see any of the reports on those things. We don't have any kind of judgment on that. That's going to be our next point as well. The things reported are not inherently good. There's a tendency to say, well, Mordecai did it, and Mordecai's a good guy, therefore it's good. But that's not actually true. David stole the showbread from the temple. That wasn't good. Jesus says that's unlawful. And a lot of people will hear that and say, yeah, but David did it, so it's good. And that's the exact thing that Jesus is trying to debunk when he says, David took the showbread from the temple, which is not lawful for anyone except the priests to eat. Do you not hear this, you idiots? Are you not aware? This is the wrong opinion. If you think David's doing something that's good, you are incorrect. This is not lawful. When people hear these things reported, sometimes they see good people and then they do something and they say, well, that must be good because the guy is good. That's not true. A history is, by definition, is a report of the thing that happened. And people do messed up stuff all the time. If you go into history expecting that the heroes, the good guys always do the right thing, you clearly don't have an understanding of history. because sometimes the things that are reported are not inherently good. And we get that really easily when Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. Oh, that was a bad thing to do, even though it's told us in the Bible. Nobody's going to say, well, we see biblical examples of selling your brother into slavery, so it must be good. Nobody's going to say that because that's stupid and we all know it. But then people will look at all these other controversial issues and say, well, it's not actually controversial because the good guy chose this. But just because something happened, just because a generally good person made a decision, doesn't mean it's good. Abraham lied about his wife and then when he was young and weak in the faith, and then he lied about his wife when he was old and more faithful. That's a problem. That's not inherently good just because Abraham did it. And we understand it when it's really obvious, but sometimes when it's a little more questionable or a little more we're not sure how to parse it, we just kind of err on the side of saying it's okay. Be careful with that. What kind of history are you talking about? It's just history that happened. It's the stuff that happened. That means it's, by definition, unapproved. God didn't say it's actually good. We should talk about that. This is history that is undetermined, which is to say, not that it didn't happen, but it is to say that sometimes we're the ones who are supposed to be judging it. When God says in Genesis 1, let there be light, and there was the light, and he divided the light from the day. He called the darkness night, and he called the light day. He called the darkness light. He divided the two, and God saw that it was good. Okay, if I read Genesis 1 and I look at God's creation of light and say, I don't know about that, you messed up somewhere. God said that it was good. That is determined. God is very clear on that. And sometimes God does weigh in on these things. When Moses strikes the rock in front of God, when God told him to speak to the rock and Moses strikes it anyway, God says, Moses, because you struck the rock, you are not going into the land of Canaan. You did not listen to me. You are not going into the land of Canaan. That was bad, Moses. That's pretty clear where I can then say, that was bad, Moses. When God says, Ahab became king in Israel, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, that is a very clear moral judgment statement. When God says, Joseph told his brothers his dreams, was that a good thing to do? Was that a righteous thing to do? Was that a wise thing to do? I have no idea. Because God doesn't say, Joseph told his brothers his dreams, and that was a wise thing to do, but his brothers were evil, and so they took it poorly. God says, he told his brothers his dreams. And here's what happened, right? He doesn't tell us whether it was good or bad. He doesn't tell us whether it was right or wrong. He doesn't tell us whether it was wise or not. He just says, it happened. And then we get to make our own decisions off of that. Personally, I think it was perfectly fine for him to do. I don't think he's doing it unrighteously. It seems like, I don't know, if anything, I would peg legitimate curiosity on that, or maybe a willingness to overshare, to share what he was thinking, and maybe he pushed that a little too far when he saw his brothers get upset. If he saw his brothers get upset over the first dream, why did he go ahead and share the second dream as well? Can you really say that was just innocent curiosity at what was happening? Maybe it was him trying to, egg them on a little bit and say, hey, I keep getting special dreams and you don't. At the same time, maybe it's just him trying to actually appeal to them and trying to be part of the family and saying, hey, I have this question. I'm not sure what to do with it. Notice that Joseph in Genesis 37 doesn't say, hey, I had this dream where the 12 stars bowed down to my star. That means you're all going to bow down to me. Joseph says, hey, I had this weird dream, and the brothers say, what, do you think we're going to bow down to you? The brothers are the ones interpreting. Maybe Joseph is asking for verification to say, hey, I'm not sure exactly what this means. Can you help interpret this for me? We're not told which one it is. Sometimes we have to make the judgments on that. And depending on what I judge Joseph's motivation to be, is going to change what my interpretation is. You need to be aware this is undetermined history. Sometimes we are the ones who have to make the judgments on it, but you also have to be aware of what judgments you are making. Because if I have an assumption that Mordecai is a bad person in Esther, which I do, I read Esther quite differently than other people do, because when Mordecai does stuff, I am automatically inclined to think it's bad. Because a lot of the stuff, quite frankly, he does is bad, in my opinion. I'm going to get a very different application from Esther than other people will. maybe God's left that up to me to determine. Maybe he hasn't. There is a truth. He was either pretty good or pretty bad, but I don't know which one it is because God didn't tell me. And so I have to read that and I have to judge it for myself. Be careful how you judge. You're going to have to make your own judgments, which is part of why interpretation is so important, but you're also going to have to make those judgments with the awareness of the judgments that you're making. If you read Joseph's story and you just automatically assume that everything he does is good, you're going to get a different impression than if you read Joseph's story and say, hey, I think he messed up a lot of stuff, but God came through for him in the end. Sometimes we're the ones who make the judgment on it. Be careful what judgment you make and be aware that you're making a judgment on it. This is non-comprehensive history. Not every detail is going to be recorded. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham is the main character of Genesis from Genesis 12 through about Genesis 24. Then Isaac comes in for Genesis 25, and Jacob comes in from Genesis 26 through 36. Isaac exists. He digs a well, I think. He lies about his wife, and he shows favoritism towards his children, but that's in Jacob's story. That's all that Isaac does. We have no idea who Isaac is, right? We have very little history on him. We have very little understanding of him. We have very little of his personality. We have very little of his faithfulness. We don't know, was he generally faithful or generally unfaithful? I have no idea, because I get told a story about, the one major story we have is that he lied about his wife like his father Abraham did when he was being unfaithful, but then, he seems to still live in the land of Canaan, and so he kind of has faith. I have no idea, because the Bible is non-comprehensive history. The Bible is not setting out to say, hey, here's everything that's ever happened in the human race. It's setting out to say, hey, here's the relevant stuff, and you don't have all the details, so leave it sometimes. This is historical history, which is to say it's not written to answer your questions. Not just that this is a literal history that happened, but this is history that is not written to answer the questions that you have directly. When you read Matthew chapter 19, Jesus discusses marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He's asked a question on divorce. He says, don't do it. They say, well, Moses said it was cool. And Jesus says, no, you guys are idiots and haven't read the Bible. Basically, that's the gist of it. But a lot of times when you're discussing the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, people will bring up different passages. They'll bring up Malachi chapter 2, which is divorce is bad, probably relevant. They'll bring up Ezra chapter 9 and 10, where divorce was recommended by the character of Ezra. Ezra said, hey, you've married someone you shouldn't have. You shouldn't be married to them, therefore you should divorce them. And say, well, that's a justification for divorce. But Ezra 9 was not written to be a commentary on Matthew 19. Ezra 9 is something else entirely. He was dealing with a very different situation. In Matthew 19, the question is, can you divorce your wife for any reason at all? And the answer is, no, that's stupid. Why did Moses say you could do it sometimes then? And Jesus gives the one exception that there could possibly be, which is sexual immorality. When Ezra speaks in Ezra 9 and 10, he's dealing with people who violated the law of God. God said, don't marry the people of the land, and they went in and married the people of the land. Ezra is trying to fix that problem, which is different than what Jesus is trying to address. When you try and say Ezra is a commentary for Matthew 19, or when you try and say, well, here's my interpretation of Matthew 19 because Ezra tells me this thing, you fundamentally misunderstood the point of the narrative. Ezra was not written to answer that. You can take concepts from Ezra and say, hey, here's how I think this would work, but if you're trying to bind Ezra as the answer, you've messed up. You've gone way too far. That's not what the history is for, and that's not how it is written. Also, on the mention of Ezra, we should also say a lot of times people who are arguing for the marriage, divorce, and remarriage principle, when they are arguing the part of Ezra to say sometimes divorce is justified in this kind of situation, a lot of times they're saying that because Ezra in Ezra chapter 10, I've had a lot of people make very concentrated arguments on this, that Ezra chapter 7, verses 7 through 10 say Ezra had set his heart to know the law and to do it and to teach it throughout all of Israel or something like that. He had really intensely focused on trying to understand what God wanted and then doing what God wanted. And then the conclusion of that is he commands them to divorce in this situation. And the answer is, well, Ezra really wanted to do what's righteous. Can you really believe that someone who is so dedicated to trying to do what was righteous is doing something unrighteous? Therefore, the divorce in Ezra 9 and 10 is good and what God wanted. But this comes back to unapproved and undetermined history, which is to say, God never said, and it was good that Ezra did that. God never says it's bad that Ezra did that. God just doesn't say it's good that Ezra did that. We are left to make that determination on our own. And I, for one, don't believe it was good that Ezra did that, because I'm not someone who says the things reported are inherently good. I'm very well aware Ezra was trying to be righteous. I am very well aware that he commanded them to divorce. I very much disagree that that was the righteous decision. It wasn't written to answer our questions from Matthew. And by the way, it wasn't written to answer our questions about Ezra 9 and 10. And we have no idea if it was righteous or not. And we're just not told that. And there's some things you have to do some thinking about. Now, if you want to say, hey, because of these principles from other places in Scripture, I believe that that was justified, sure, fine, that works. But Ezra doesn't say that. And so every judgment that's going to be made on that has to be couched to some degree with a level of, hey, I think this, but I'm not exactly sure because it doesn't exactly say. So I think it's the last thing on this list, or maybe there's one more. These are implicative. This is implicative history. Some points are not explicitly stated out for us. Sometimes you can make implications. Again, it's not going to be like a hidden meaning. It's not going to be super secret, but some points are not explicitly stated, but you can still infer them than what they are. And ultimately, this is autobiographical writing. God is writing and God's the hero. And so if you lose that point, you've missed the point of the history. This is all about God. This is about God working through people. This is about God working with people. That does not mean they were good people. That does not mean they were bad people. That just means they were people and God worked through them. He worked with them. He used them with their willing cooperation, and he did his work even though they tried to oppose him at different points. This is history. This is who God is, and this is how God functions. That's what history is supposed to communicate to us. So there are a few particular dangers in history when you're trying to deal with these narratives and interpret them, such as the danger of allegorizing, or essentially trying to jump into a secondary application instead of trying to understand what was actually happening back in the moment. An allegory is this idea that, Joseph, instead of investigating what Joseph was thinking and what he was feeling and how it was working and what the life was like at that time and all the different contexts of these situations, allegorizing kind of just jumps over that and says, well, Joseph got sold into slavery by his brothers, so the application is have better brothers, which is kind of stupid, right? It's not that the application is necessarily wrong, but it is that you are missing the entire point of the story when you just jump over and start applying things to yourself. There's a reason that the process, it should be, what does it say? What does it mean? And then what does it mean to me? What does it say? Like what's actually laid out there? What does it mean? How would Joseph have heard that? And what does that mean to me? Now that I understand how people have always heard it, how do I make that application to my personal life? If you just jump over the second step and you never consider like how things actually were back in the day, you just kind of say, well, whatever, let's make application, you're going to miss some of the point. Don't do that. Right. Pay attention to the actual context that it's in. Context, speaking of, decontextualizing is another dangerous thing. Texts already have history, so be aware of that. And this can be in a couple of different ways. This could be in a cultural sense. Texts already have history. When you're talking about Joseph, he's living at a particular point in time. He's living in the land of Canaan until he's living in the land of Egypt, and things are different. Joseph, I should probably write down. When Joseph comes out of prison, and I think it's Genesis like 42 or something like that. He comes out of prison and he's going to see Pharaoh, and what does he do? He shaves. It's not just that he shaves, his face because he has a 5 o'clock shadow or whatever it is, and he needs to clean up a little bit to be presentable. It's not just that he needs to be presentable. It's not that it's not teaching the principle of be presentable before Pharaoh. What happens there is in Egypt, culturally at that time, especially since, Egypt is pretty warm, people would just shave all the hair because, it helps them to live throughout that heat. But also in Egypt at that time, I believe total kind of shaving of the body is associated with cleanliness and purity, and especially with like religious things. And so what Joseph is doing is in many ways playing into the idea of being a holy man by shaving his hair. It's probably not just his facial hair. It's probably just his hair in general, as far as I know. At least the shaving of the head as well as the beard, if not everything else as well, because that's what holy people did. And so there's a cultural context to that. You should act like holy people. That's the application. Now, there may be a secondary application of, hey, if you're going into an authority figure, make sure you don't look like trash. Sure, that's not a terrible application, but that's not really the point of the story. And if you just allegorize everything to jump to the secondary application, if you rip it from its cultural context, you miss the point. And hopefully that is a good illustration of both of those principles. You should also take into account that texts also have a context of being in the Bible as well. Again, Joseph's story is not just that one story from Genesis 42. It's Genesis 37 through 50, which is a part of Genesis, which is a part of the Bible in general. If you rip stories out of their biblical context, sometimes you miss the point of those stories. When stories are told back to back, they can be told back to back for a reason. Genesis 38 is this weird, horrific story where Judah, Joseph's brother Judah, there's no good way to say what he does. He has sex with his daughter-in-law because he won't provide her a real husband, so he hires her like a prostitute and gets up to some stuff, shall we say. Yeah. What in the world? Why did God decide to write that in there? That just seems kind of weird. And it's happening in between Genesis 37, which is about Joseph, and between Genesis 39, which is about Joseph. And then there's this random insertion where, that's unfortunate terminology. There's this random story where Judah does this thing. Why in the world is that there? It's because Judah's the one who sold Joseph into slavery. Chapter 37. Judah is fairly messed up. How messed up is Judah? Genesis 38 shows you how messed up he is. It shows you what the problem is. And at the end of Genesis 38, Judah says, man, I need to fix some things in my life because this is incredibly wrong. Then you get a couple chapters later and you get into the 40s, and suddenly who's the one who's trustworthy before his father? Who's the one who Jacob won't send Benjamin to Egypt because what if something happens to Benjamin? Reuben says, hey, if something happens to Benjamin, you can take my children instead. And Jacob says, that's stupid. I don't care. And then Judah comes in the next chapter and says, we are going back to Egypt. I am taking Benjamin. And Jacob says, okay. What in the world happened between chapters 37 and 43, I think it is, for Jacob to now trust Judah so much? 38 happened, and Judah started to change. He has history there. When the Bible starts bringing stories up about Judah, they have a context with each other. And if you're not considering the greater picture of who Judah is, you're going to miss why 38 was there, or why 37 was there, or why 43 and 44 are such a great payoff to that story. Don't decontextualize biblically, historically, culturally, whatever it is. A third issue that you will have, I forgot to reselect this, is selectivity, which is to say hyper-focusing on individual points. If you are very, very particular about one specific detail in a story and interpret everything else by the lens of that detail, you will get a very different story than if you interpret everything by the lens of a different detail. If you interpret everything in Genesis 37 because through the lens of Joseph had a special coat and that messed everything up, then you attribute a lot of the problems to Jacob and Jacob giving the coat to Joseph. Maybe that's fair. If you translate everything, or if you interpret everything in Genesis 37 by the lens of Jacob, or by the lens of Joseph telling his brothers his stories or his dreams in a mocking way, that he's making fun of them and their inadequacy, then you're going to interpret Joseph's story quite a bit differently. If you say that Joseph is being if you say that Joseph is being completely legitimate, and he's having these dreams and he's very curious about them, that's one interpretation. If you say he is just making up the dreams and they're not real, that's incorrect. But also, that's just a whole different, that's totally misreading the Bible, but it's also a very different way to interpret the story. And so people who hyper-focus on individual points to inform their interpretation, that can be dangerous. Be careful with that. You do need to focus on particular points because particular points do mean particular things, but if you are only ever on one thing and you never allow yourself to consider any other possibilities, or if you're just blind to the fact that you are carrying one point as if God himself has said it and one point as if it wasn't really supposed to be in there at all, if you hyper-focus on one over the other, you're going to have an unbalanced view of the scripture. A third thing is overgeneralizing, zooming out way too much. There is a time and place to say that Joseph's story in Genesis 37 is the picture of someone falling into sin and getting redeemed. There's a point at which you can say that because it is true to some extent. But if that is your whole interpretation of Joseph, you kind of missed the point, because if I zoom out, anything can sound pretty good. A couple of weeks ago, I preached on Balaam. Balaam is fascinating because if you look at Balaam's story from a general enough perspective, he seems pretty legitimate. He has a call to go and prophesy. He receives the word of God and gives it. And then ultimately he is killed by Israel because of what he said. What I have just stated is all true. And what I have just stated is incredibly misleading because Jeremiah received a call to go prophesy. Jeremiah received the word of God. Jeremiah spoke the word of God, and Jeremiah was ultimately killed because he said the word of God. Isaiah is the same way. A bunch of the prophets are the same way. And if I summarize Balaam as generally as that, then suddenly you start to think Balaam is righteous. But then you zoom in a little bit and you realize that all of the details of Balaam's story are telling you the complete opposite. Jeremiah receives a call from God to go and prophesy. Balaam receives a call from the king of Moab, Balak, to go and prophesy. God says, don't go, and Balaam ends up going anyway. That's a prophetic call. It is a call to go and prophesy, but it's not the prophetic call of Jeremiah. It's nothing close to that. Balaam does deliver the message of God, but he doesn't want to. Jeremiah, or rather, it's not just that Balaam doesn't want to. He actively wants to deliver the opposite message, but God forces him not to. Balaam does go and die for what he said, but he dies for what he said because he told Balak the way to curse the children of Israel, resulting in 24,000 people dying. Yeah, it's justified in Balaam's situation. Jeremiah didn't do anything wrong. He shouldn't have been killed. It was unjustified. It was unfair for him to die. Balaam, it was good that he died because he was a horrible, evil person. When you overgeneralize, when you zoom out way too much, if you're not careful with it, you can conflate stories when they are not at all the same. Be careful about that. You can also create a false combination. My dad would say correlation does not equal causation. It's an economics principle. Just because something is in the story doesn't mean that it caused itself. Joseph got sold into slavery. Joseph became king of Egypt. Therefore, if you want to become king of Egypt, you should be sold into slavery. Therefore, application, if I want to be king of America, I got to go sell myself into slavery. Or rather, get my brother to do it. No, right? That's not how that worked. sometimes you can say, well, just because two elements exist in the same story, you can say they caused each other, but that's not actually true. Oftentimes, it's just that they happen to be in the same story. Correlation is not causation. And sometimes we just do redefining stuff, which is ignoring the plain meaning. If you overly define everything, if you change definitions of words, if you start to dive in, there's a helpful amount of, what does this word mean? Like, what does this word technically mean? And then finding how that fits in the situation. But sometimes people use words to get a sense across. Saying I love pizza does not mean I am romantically entangled with pizza. It means that I enjoy it. You're putting a little too much weight on the word love there. And sometimes if you overly define everything, then you ignore the plain meaning, which is just I enjoy pizza, and you start to think I do some really weird things with pizza, and that's uncomfortable, so we'll move on. Sometimes people appeal to external authority. What happens when I record these for an hour plus is I just kind of start saying things, and then... sometimes it's better in person, sometimes it's not. It helps that I have a 45-minute time limit. When you have external authority, sometimes you read other books into it. This is especially prominent in like epistles and stuff, but you can also do this for the marriage, divorce, remarriage example. If you read Matthew 19 into Ezra 9, that's probably not correct. If you read Ezra 9 into Matthew 19, that may be correct. That may be something that Jesus is relying on because Ezra is previous information for Jesus in Matthew's time period, but Matthew is not prior information for Ezra. Do not read other books into it. Sometimes we read something, and even, I just did this in... What was it? Oh, yes, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 identifies idols with demons in 1 Corinthians 10 in that context. And I, in Deuteronomy 18, identify idols with demons back in Deuteronomy 18. I don't know that that's what Israel was thinking. I don't know that that is actually what Israel believed. I don't know that that's something Israel was aware of. I think it's true because Paul said it, but Paul said it so much later in the timeline. When he says don't trust people who are sacrificing to idols, when Moses says that in Deuteronomy 18, he says don't sacrifice to idols. I don't know that Moses is meaning don't sacrifice to idols which are actually demons. I think he's meaning probably don't sacrifice to idols, thinking that, maybe other gods do exist, right? From a more educated point of view, we understand other gods do not exist, and only God is the true God. There are other spiritual beings that exist that you can sacrifice to, but that would be a mistake. That would be a more accurate way to say what Moses is saying, but Moses wasn't aware of that. And so when he says don't sacrifice to idols, what he probably means is don't sacrifice to idols. If I read other books into what I'm saying, I can very easily come to false conclusions about what those people actually believed. There is a tendency to moralize. Aesop's fables are stories that didn't happen. A dog did not talk to a crane. The crane was not like drinking water or whatever it was, right? The long-necked vase or whatever it was. I haven't read Aesop's fables in a long time. I used to read them all the time. Haven't read them in a long time. The point of a fable is to come up with the moral of the story. The moral of the story is don't be a jerk to everybody else, right? Okay, cool. If I read the Bible and I say the moral of the story is don't be a jerk to everybody else, I'm not wrong, but that's really not what the Bible was about. Don't make your stories just into fables. Like they teach a life skill and they do nothing other than that. It's not all about moralizing. And finally, personalizing. I think this is final. I can't actually see what's coming up. I'm just working off of my memory on what I had. Personalizing is trying to say that everybody in the story is experiencing things that directly apply to you. Not everybody experiences things that directly apply to your situation. A lot of times you're experiencing things along the same lines or you're experiencing things in the same vein. But if you have a boss at work and your boss's wife wants to seduce you, you are not dealing with the same situation that Joseph was dealing with because he was a slave. And he was a slave. He was a highly respected slave, but he was still a slave. He was bought and paid for. You were not bought and paid for. You voluntarily employed yourself somewhere. That is a little bit different, right? Not everything directly applies to you. The same general principle of, hey, your boss's wife is not your wife, so leave her alone, is still true, but not everything directly applies to you in the same way. So be careful about making absolute, definitive, direct application statements. Ultimately, what we see in narratives is something that's pretty important, summed up by this on my copy of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, second edition. In this particular copy, this is on page 93, where they say, in summation about narratives, narratives are precious to us because they so vividly demonstrate God's involvement in the world and illustrate his principles and calling. They thus teach us a lot, but what they directly teach us does not systematically include personal ethics. For this area of life, we must turn elsewhere in the scriptures to the various places where personal ethics are actually taught categorically and explicitly. In other words, when you see narratives, you will see people offer sacrifices. But if you want to know what sacrifices are being offered when and what makes that appropriate and what God was requiring, you have to read the part where God actually talks about that. You have to read laws. And that's why next time we're going to be talking about Old Testament laws. This has been narratives. Again, there's a lot in it, and there's a lot more than people usually think there is. But here we are, an hour and 10 minutes later. Finally, the talk about narratives is done, and so I will leave it there, and hopefully that is interesting to you. Now, I will absolutely desync this class with this information. That's not all going to fit in 1 week of class in the auditorium. So at some point, I may skip a week to try and kind of equalize those or whatever, but I don't know. I may just keep going until this class is done and then finish out the class in there and then catch back up whenever that works. Either way, I hope you benefited from this. There's a lot that goes into narratives and people really don't think about it. A lot of times, all the stuff that I named, a lot of people just kind of intuit that, except most people don't intuit that not everything you read is good. Most people are not that particular and most people are not that careful about that. But most of the time, from other Christians that I've seen read, a lot of us can do this. We just don't think about it. You can interpret it properly, but you can't explain why you're interpreting it in that particular way, and that can itself be a little bit of an issue. If you believe something, it's good that you believe it. If you do something, it's good that you do it. If you do something righteous, it's good that you do it. But if you can't explain why you're doing what you're doing, or you can't explain why you believe what you believe, you need some shoring up in those other areas. So that's part of the point of this class, and hopefully Narratives has done that for you. If you are reading Narratives, those are some general rules to think about, and hopefully that is helpful. All right, I'm going to cut the recording here, and I will see you next week where I'm preaching whatever on Monday and whatever on Friday, whatever is next in the... something about worry, I think, from the Sermon on the Mount on Friday, and we'll have Old Testament laws as a class period next Wednesday. So hopefully this has been beneficial for you. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and it's been relatively entertaining and taught you some things in a way that you're able to understand. I will see you next time.